Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to have you here. Tonight we continue on with our series, A Journey to Faith, in which we're following the genealogy of Jesus. This is lesson number 67, and in this lesson the title is Daniel and the End of the Babylonian Empire. And so this is our third portion of lesson that's under the genealogy of Jesus' descendant called Shealtiel, who is the son of King Jehoiachin. So before we launch into the lesson, we'll just put up a couple of charts to familiarise yourself with this. So the genealogy of Jesus is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 1. It goes from verses 1 through to 17, but we're just looking at the portion from verse 12 to 17 because we've already covered everything that happens before the Babylonian exile. Jeconiah here, that's Jehoiachin in the Bible, and it says there that he was the father of Shealtiel, and that's the descendant who we've been looking at currently. Now tonight, Shealtiel, this is the third lesson during his lifetime, and we draw to a close with him, and next week we move on to Zerubbabel, who of course is the person who will lead the exiles back into the former kingdom of Judah, and he will begin to rebuild there. So again tonight we'll be focusing on Shealtiel. Now, just to give you some reference here, this is Shealtiel here, son of King Jehoiachin, and this is Zerubbabel, who is the one who will lead them back. You can see there's a couple of names in between, and so we'll explain those tonight. And I'll just turn around on this side. Most people, when we talk about the Babylonian Empire, will readily recognise King Nebuchadnezzar II. He was the son of Nabonidus, but he has a son who we spoke about last week called Marduk, who's called Evil Merodach in the Bible. And we have these two claimants who we covered last week, Nergal-Shareser and Labashi Marduk, who only survived for a very short period of time. And currently we're under the rule of the Babylonian Empire under Nabonidus, and his son Belshazzar, known as Belshazzar in the Bible, is actually the king of Babylon itself, whereas Nabonidus is the king of the Babylonian Empire. And so what this tells us is during the reign of Nabonidus, after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, that Daniel was no longer the king of Babylon or the governor of Babylon during that period of time. Now, we've already introduced Cyrus the Great, or King Cyrus II, and he is the person who's going to send Zerubbabel back with the Jewish exiles back into Jerusalem. So he is already on the march. Again, this is covered in the previous lessons. And so tonight he will overcome the Babylonian Empire, and this will be the close of exactly 70 years for Babylon, which is what the prophet Jeremiah spoke about. So once again, that's not 70 years of exile, but it's 70 years of rule from 605 BC with Nebuchadnezzar right through to 539 BC with the end of the empire. So that's just a little bit of background to help us get started. And I'll just leave that map up behind us as we get underway with the lesson. Now, we're going to start off with a little bit of historical content to set the scene for what's actually happening here. Last week we had a look at two of the visions or dreams of Daniel, and this week we start off by this historical content because last week we were looking at the three future empires that will come through those prophetic words. And of course, Cyrus is one of those empires. So there's a fellow by the name of King Cyrus from the Lydian Empire. So this is the Lydian Empire over here in green. And he was the last buffer that separated the Greeks from the expanding power of the Medo-Persians. So we've got Greece over this side, and we've got the former Median Empire, which has now been assimilated with the Persians to form one almighty big empire. Now the Bible talks about Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, and its king Nebuchadnezzar at the time said how he was the ruler of the world. And yet you can see that the actual space that he occupied is actually far smaller than the Medes and the Persians. So the Lydians, you can see, have a fair old size space here. This is modern day Turkey. On the other side, the Dardanelles here is Constantinople and the Black Sea above. So these are the people currently occupying what is today's Turkey. Now, it says that King Croesus from the Lydian Empire had an alliance with the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So he also formed an alliance with Sparta. So we're going to start hearing some new names, because the empire that comes after the Persian Empire, of course, is the Greek Empire, which we learnt about in the prophecies. And so as the Persian Empire does its thing, the Greek Empire over here is also changing at the same time. So because this empire is further to this direction, it had alliances with other nations on the other side, so they didn't come against them. So Sparta was the most powerful Greek state. So feeling secure with his alliances, he set out to actually campaign against King Cyrus, history tells us. So he's obviously concerned about Cyrus expanding this way, and so he's got the support of the Greeks, so he actually wants to come back this way and stop them from expanding. So in the battle that ensued between the Lydians and the Medo-Persians in the year 547 BC, General Harpagus from Media joined with General Mazars from Persia and suggested the unorthodox use of camels in their front line attack. Now, General Harpagus, we spoke about last week, his son was killed and he actually changed sides from the Medians to the Persians, and that's what actually unified the two empires together. You may remember that his son was actually murdered and he was actually cooked and fed back to the general. So he was determined to end the Median rule. And so that's his backstory. And so the smell of the approaching camels apparently caused the horses of the Lydian cavalry to panic and scatter. Ultimately, this actually led to their defeat. It's funny, isn't it, when we look at wars? There's all these technology, all these battle methods, and it's always these funny, quirky little things that seems to overcome the enemy. So in this story, the horses were not familiar with camels, which came out of these drier, hot regions, and they panicked and they fled. So this led to their defeat, and so by the prophecy of Daniel, this meant that the bear had won again. And part of that prophecy talked about that they would overcome the Lydians. And so this is another fulfillment of prophecy, even though it's very historical. So General Mazars from Persia was also killed during this conflict. So King Cyrus II turned over the conquest of Asia Minor. Now Asia Minor is going to be a new name, and it represents this whole area here, today's Turkey. So whenever we talk about Asia Minor, it represents this region. As the different eras changed, the names for those regions also changed. And so he changed the conquest over to General Harpagus, who had stood beside him. So the Median general repaid the trust placed in his leadership, and by 546 BC he went on to conquer Ionia, Phoenicia, Caria, Lycia, Paphlagonia, Phrygia and Tabal. So these are places from here all the way around the coast here. So he went on to conquer many of these regions. Cilicia was one of them. So after the completion of his conquests, General Harpagus was rewarded for his success when King Cyrus appointed him a satrap, which means governor in their language, over the region known as Asia Minor. So he becomes the person who takes care of this region here. Okay, so moving back towards the biblical story, blended with the history, is after conquering the kingdom of Edom, which we mentioned last year, King Nabonidus, who is the now Babylonian ruler, now controlled the direct highway from Babylon to the Gulf of Aqaba. And so what that means is these river systems were the way that they followed up, and then they came back down the coast here to travel, because this is all very arid desert in the middle. And so when they came down, they conquered Edom down here. Edom is significant because there's a highway called the King's Highway, and it travels all the way down through this region. So by conquering this region, it gave them access to the south. And so because it had control of this, it becomes significant in tonight's story. So he went further south in 553 BC to the rich desert oasis of a place called Tamar, or Teman in alternate languages. I'll just pop that up. And that's this place down here. Again, we did mention this last week. So the ruler of the Babylonian Empire went from here up, down, and continued further south until he ended up down here in Tamar. So he left his son, Belshazzar, as we know him in the Bible, to rule Babylon in his absence. And so that's why his story is in the palace when we come up to it. At the same time, Media's general Harpagus and his army joined King Cyrus II and his army to go northwest from the plain of Pasargadae to Ecbatana to depose King Astyages of Media. So sorry for all these names, but we're going to give you this background. And so they came from here to overcome the king here. So this is a reshuffling of the power in the empire that we can actually see is going on here. Now amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a fragment called 4Q. They're all given lovely names. There's a fragment called 4Q242 known as the Prayer of Nabonidus. And it reveals that King Nabonidus suffered in Tamar, this place he went to, from what's known as an evil ulcer for 7 years, take note, by decree of the Lord. And so we're talking a little bit before the lesson about King Nebuchadnezzar. You might remember how he went mad, or he was sent mad, and he went eating grass for 7 years until he submitted himself to the God of Israel. And so here we are with King Nabonidus, because you have to remember that God's hand is on this plan. And we find that he gives him an evil ulcer by decree. And this is how the transcript reads. It says, the words of the prayer uttered by Nabonidus, king of the land of Babylon, the great king, when he was afflicted with an evil ulcer in Taman, so that's their language word for Tamar, by decree of the Most High God. Excuse my typo. I was afflicted with an evil ulcer for 7 years. And an exorcist pardoned my sins. There's the extraordinary part. He was a Jew from among the children of the exile of Judah, and he said, recount this in writing to glorify and exalt the Most High God. And so this is what he wrote. I was afflicted with an evil ulcer in Taman by decree of the Most High God for 7 years. I prayed to the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone and clay, because I believed that they were gods. And so here's Nabonidus. He's declaring that he didn't believe, obviously, that the God of Israel was the God Most High, the God Almighty, the creator of the universe, and he believes in other man-made gods. And here he is with this evil ulcer when he has an exodus come to pardon his sins, who turns out to be a Jewish person from among the exile of Judah. And he told him to recount, to glorify and exalt the name of the Most High God. And so he finds himself in exactly the same situation that King Nebuchadnezzar was. 7 years, basically out in the wilderness, completely different place, and he's suffering. And so his pathway back from his suffering is by recounting to God. Now the Nabonidus Chronicle, which we've touched on before, which is incomplete because of part of the clay cuneiform tablet was broken, reveals their last definite year recorded for King Nabonidus staying in Tamar from the remaining section. And this was his 11th year of reign in 545 BC. And it reads, the 11th year the king was in Tamar, while the prince, the officers and his army were in Akkad. Now Akkad is the ancient name for the top half of Mesopotamia, of which Babylon is part of. The king did not come to Babylon in the month Nisan, so there's that Jewish month name, which is actually a Babylonian word. Nabu did not come to Babylon, Bel did not come out, the Akitu festival did not take place, the offerings in Esagil and Azida were presented to the gods of Babylon and Borsippa as in normal times. So basically what happened every year was that the king would go to the city and they would have the temples and they would parade all of their false gods and people would come out and worship them. But because the king was sick and he didn't go back, it didn't actually happen. And so this is recorded in history, giving evidence to the fact that he wasn't actually there. And so when you read the Bible, and we have the story of Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, it can be a little bit confusing because you're sort of wondering, well, why isn't Nabonidus there and isn't he the king? And is the son the king or is his father the king? It can be a little bit hard, but when we look at the historical record, it explains very clearly that his father was down in Tamar whilst he was back in Babylon ruling over the Babylonian city. So the next 5 years of cuneiform inscriptions on the Nabonidus Chronicle is missing because the clay tablet is damaged. But as King Cyrus of Persia continued to campaign with his united Median and Persian army, his growing empire became an increasing threat to the Babylonian Empire. In the 17th year of reign, in the month of Tevet, is again another one of those names of the Jewish calendar, in 539 BC, King Nabonidus returned to the city of Babylon in time for this festival I just mentioned called Akitu. And it's a New Year's festival dedicated to their god Marduk. But this year was to herald the end of the Babylonian Empire. The transcript reads, the 17th year, Nabu came from Borsippa for the procession of Bel. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned about Bel last week, but we are this week about who Bel is. Bel is actually mentioned in the Bible. Is anyone familiar with whom Bel is, or have you heard that word before in the book of Daniel? Okay, so I'll come to that in a moment. So Bel came out in the month Tevet. The king entered Eterkalama in the temple. He made a libation of wine. Bel came out. They performed the Akitu festival as in normal times in the month, and we don't have that in the transcript. Now the gods there, they're called Marad, Zababa, and the gods of Kish, Ninlul. There's a Hersakalama, and they all entered Babylon. So what this actually means is that the outlying towns or cities around Babylon, they each had different gods. And so they would bring them to the capital city to parade them for the New Year festival. So until the end of the month, these gods from everywhere were entering Babylon. Now, when Cyrus was coming along, he came to battle at a place called Opis on the bank of the Tigris River against the army of the Babylonians. And the people of Babylonia retreated. He carried off the plunder and slaughtered the people. So what this is telling us is that whilst they were having their festival and the army was all busy, King Cyrus the Great used that moment to come against the Babylonians. So this is the story of how he overcame them. On the 14th day, this place called Sippur was captured without a battle. And so this is Sippur here. So there's Babylon. Sippur's just on the other side there. And it's the record, the historical record says that Nabonidus, King Nabonidus, he fled. So at this point in time, he panicked and left. So on the 16th day, a governor called Ugbaru and the army of Cyrus, without battle, it says they entered Babylon. So there was actually no battle when they got to Babylon itself. Afterwards, after Nabonidus retreated, he was captured in Babylon until the end of the month. The troops from this place called Gujim surrounded the gates of Esagil, which is their big temple there in Babylon. So it was obviously closed up. The reason it was closed up was because they were having this festival with all of the gods there. So what it's telling us here is that they didn't actually interrupt the festival. They just let them keep having a party or whatever they were doing whilst they completely took over Babylon and took over the city. So King Cyrus is a pretty smart guy. So it says on the 3rd month of the month, Arashama, Cyrus entered Babylon. It says the Haru vessels were filled before him. There was peace in the city while Cyrus, his greeting to Babylon in his entirety, spoke. Gubru, his district officer, appointed the district officers in Babylon. So they started organising how they were going to govern the city. From the month of Kislevu to the month of Adaru, the gods of Akkad, which Nabonidus had brought to Babylon, returned to their places. So that's telling us that all of the festival was over. The people then took the gods back out to the various locations where they came from. And on the 9th of the 11th of the month of Arashama, Agbaru, sorry I'm struggling with a few of these words, died. So in the month the king's wife died, and from the 27th of the month to the 3rd of the month there was an official mourning period in Akkad, and all of the people bared their heads. So in the Babylonian New Year, this is the explanation, so that's all of the detail from history, and it's quite complex because there's a lot of names in there. But in the Babylonian New Year, the people of Babylon would celebrate their chief god Marduk, whom they believe created order in the universe. They considered Babylon was the heart of the cosmos, and Marduk's shrine, called Esagil, was the centre of the universe. They considered their god so holy that his name was almost never spoken nor written down. Instead, they used the word Bel. So Marduk is called Bel, and we'll reveal this in the scripture in Daniel in a moment. And the word Bel means Lord. So anyone who observes a god or a master will call them Lord. So the word Bel in their language means Lord. So other cities in Babylonia had their own gods and goddesses, but Marduk was the chief god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The god Marduk is mentioned by name only once in the Bible, when the Lord spoke about Babylon through the prophet Jeremiah. So in the book of Jeremiah, so we finally get to the Bible now, in chapter 50 verse 2, so Jeremiah 50 verse 2, it says that Babylon will be captured, Bel will be put to shame, and Marduk filled with terror. So Jeremiah chapter 50 verse 2. We have some more scriptures coming from Jeremiah. So just to repeat, Babylon will be captured, Bel will be put to shame, Marduk filled with terror. So Jeremiah is prophesying these very events that were happening. And notice when he does this, he's saying Babylon will be captured at the same time that Bel will be put to shame and Marduk filled with terror. Why? Because they were having this festival for the new year in which they were worshipping their false god. So Bel, however, is mentioned twice more in the Bible. Firstly, when the prophet Isaiah spoke the word of the Lord about the gods of Babylon. Now I have another scripture from Jeremiah, but I'll just read out the one from Isaiah first. And he said, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden. So that's Isaiah 46 verse 1. And so what he's paying mention to there is that these are false idols because they're being carried on the back of carts. They're not a true living God. And so this is what Isaiah says. So again, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden. Now they say idols. So in other words, they actually are talking about this very festival. Both Isaiah and Jeremiah are prophesying about the festival where the idols come together and then they're taken away again, borne on beasts of burden. So in other words, here they're actually describing these events that are actually happening. If we didn't have the backstory, which is a little bit complicated, these scriptures would be hard to make sense of. And yet when you understand the festival that they had and they brought the idols in from other places and then returned them after the festival, suddenly this makes sense that they're borne by beasts of burden. Now the second one the Lord declared through the prophet Jeremiah, and it's Jeremiah 51, and I'm going to read two verses from Jeremiah 51. The first one is from 44 and the second one is from 48. So Jeremiah 51 verse 44, and then I'll read 48. So 44 reads, "I will punish Bel in Babylon and make him spew out what he has swallowed." I did mention this one last week. What do you think he's going to spew out? He's going to make him spew out. This is the prophet speaking, Jeremiah.
The Jews.
Right, the Jews. So the people that they've held in captivity in the name of their God are going to be spewed out. Now you may remember that Nebuchadnezzar came to know God, but these sons that came after him went back to the worship of false idols. It's like the story of Kings in the Bible. So what happens is they're back to worshipping Marduk. Okay? And so we find this. So that's verse 44. Verse 48 says, "Then heaven and earth and all that is in them will shout for joy over Babylon, for out of the north destroyers will attack her." So when Babylon attacked the kingdom of Judah, they came from the north, the Bible says. Now when we read the story which I just gave you of the account of Cyrus and what happened, what did it say? It said that they went to Sippur first and then to Babylon. So they've come down from the north. And so history once again bears out witness to the prophetic word of the Bible. Every single thing that's spoken about, the idols coming and going on carts, the fact that they're in Babylon worshipping, the fact that they came down from the north and conquered Sippur before they came down to Babylon, the prophets are telling us before it happened that this is what's going to happen. And so when I get into all of the details of history, it's really there to bear witness to the truth of the Bible. And so it's quite fascinating. So those who Bel had swallowed, as I just asked the question, were the Jews, and those from the north were the Medo-Persians. And the reason for their downfall we read about in Jeremiah 51 verse 49, so the next verse. And it says, "Babylon must fall because of Israel's slain." And so you may remember that Nebuchadnezzar was doing God's work. But at the same time, it says that they were brutal and killed many people. And so their work was to take the Jews into captivity, but the outcome was that they murdered many, many people, which they didn't need to do. And so there's a price to be paid for this. And so this is the reason. So Jeremiah actually gives the reason here that Babylon must fall because of Israel's slain. So what this tells us is, again, this is because of what the Lord has said. So in 539 BC, King Nabonidus came from northeast to the city of Babylon from Borsippa, a nearby Babylonian city on the east bank of the Euphrates River, dedicated to the worship of Nabu. Now you might remember when we were calling those names out, the Bible said, where is it, Nebo? Sorry, I've lost it there. But one of the names was Nebo, so this is this Nabu. So this particular idol was meant to be the son of their false god Marduk. So coming for the procession of Bel or Marduk, the king entered Eter Kelama, which is the temple of Ishtar in the city of Babylon, and made a libation, a pouring out of wine, before going to Esagil, which is the temple dedicated to Marduk. Due to his absence, we're talking about Nabonidus, this was the first time in many years that a Kitu, or the New Year festival, was performed, because the priests of Marduk were required to have him there. So if you look at God's plan, he gave him this ulcer for 7 years. A Jewish person came to him and told him what he needed to do to get rid of the ulcer. And so he acknowledged the God of Israel. Upon acknowledging the God of Israel, he returns to Babylon. And when he returns to Babylon, God sends in King Cyrus the Great. And so we see this unfolding of God's plan. Now, as I mentioned, many gods came from other Babylonian cities, And at this time, King Cyrus, this is the sort of detailed story, he crossed the bank of the Tigris River at Opis and attacked the Babylonian army. The Babylonians retreated as the Medo-Persians slaughtered their people and carried off the plunder. On the 14th day of Elul, the city of Sippar was captured without a battle, and King Nabonidus fled to the city of Babylon. By the 16th day, Ukbru, the governor of Gutium, and the army of King Cyrus II also entered the city of Babylon without a battle, and Nabonidus was captured. For the rest of the month of Elul, the troops from Gutium who carried shields surrounded the gates of Esagil, Marduk's temple, but did not stop the performance of any rites or at any other temples. So on the third day of the month of Mareshvan, which is one of the Jewish months again, King Cyrus entered the city of Babylon. And so that's quite a bit of history, but you can see the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy. So in 559 BC, Cyrus became the king of Persia. By 549 BC, he became the king of Media, when he overcame King Astyages, we looked at last week, to unite the Medes and the Persians into one empire. Overcoming the Lydians, we mentioned when we started tonight. In 547 BC, he became the king of Lydia, and by 542 BC, led by Media's general Harpagus, he became ruler over the region of Asia Minor, including Lycia, Cilicia, and Phoenicia. And so we see now, going back to this map, that he now rules down to here, all of this, and so his territory has become huge. He hasn't gone down to this lower region here, but otherwise he's ruling all of this, almost without a battle, okay, because of the way he took over the Babylonian Empire. He obviously fought against the Lydians, they fought some other smaller battles over here, but most of this territory was just taken because they took over the rule of the Babylonians. So lastly, in 540 BC, King Cyrus conquered Elam, or Susiana, which is down here, whilst King Nabonidus had the statues of the various gods brought into the capital city of Babylon. Perhaps he sought their protection as he anticipated King Cyrus would strike there next, and strike he did. So near the beginning of October 539 BC, King Cyrus fought and won the battle at the city of Opis and routed the army of Babylon. They then advanced through Sippar, as I mentioned, and without fighting seized on the 10th of October 539 BC. King Nabonidus, who had been staying in the city of Sippar, fled to the capital city of Babylon to hide. Now, while all this is going on, his son, Nabonidus' son, is still in the palace. That's Belshazzar. So 2 days later, this fellow Ukbru, who we mentioned, and the army of King Cyrus II waited until nightfall, and this is how they got in, and dug a canal to divert the Euphrates River into a man-made basin to protect the city of Babylon against Median attacks. It was something that was already there. And the water level dropped to beneath waist height, and the troops waded across to the Ishtar Gate. So in other words, the city of Babylon was built on the side of the river. To access the city, you had to come across a bridge. They couldn't do that, so they diverted the river and walked across. So that's the details of how they did it. Okay, so King Nabonidus was the king of kings, or the emperor of the Babylonian Empire at this time. He appointed a ruler who he titled king over every province within his empire to govern under his sovereign authority. His son, King Belshazzar, not only ruled the province of Babylon as a governor, but in his absence he ruled as the co-regent of the Babylonian Empire. On the evening of the 12th of October 539 BC, so this is the last evening of the Babylonian Empire when Cyrus is entering. So here comes the story with Daniel. So on the evening of the 12th of October 539 BC, as they dug the canal to divert the Euphrates River, King Belshazzar was holding a feast in the great banquet hall of the royal palace just inside the Ishtar Gate. He had invited 1,000 nobles as his guests. And so we're going to turn to the book of Daniel, and we're going to start off with Daniel chapter 5, verse 2. So up to now, through this period of time since Babylonian exile began. We've worked through from Daniel chapter 1 through to 4, and then now we enter into chapter 5. So Daniel chapter 5 verse 2. It says, while Belshazzar was drinking wine with them, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, or they don't term father or grandfather, so his predecessor, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. But as they drank, they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone for their beauty. So going to verses 5 to 6, it says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Now, if you go forwards to Daniel 5 verse 25, it tells you what the inscription read. It said, Mene, Mene, Techel Parsin. And so I have a beautiful illustration. Oh, I beg your pardon. This is just a picture where it talks about the Medes and the Persians uniting as one army. These are actually Persian soldiers, and these are Median soldiers. So they had a different attire to each other's, and they also carried different weapons or shields to one another. So again, this is a historical relief that's actually been carved, demonstrating that the unification of these two powers together. Now going to this lovely illustration, I'll just come over to this side. Here is a portrayal of Belshazzar with an astounding look on his face and the look of fear on the others. And it says, by the lamp, the writing appeared upon the wall. And so you can see the writing up there. Now this is all pretty astounding, because if we understand what's going on, King Cyrus is down in the canal digging to get into Babylon. Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, has already been captured, and the temple has already been surrounded. He's blissfully having a party with 1,000 guests inside the Ishtar Gate, completely unaware that this is going on. And so we have the two stories sort of running side by side, as the Bible often does. And so they got this inscription. So what did King Belshazzar do? He sent for his enchanters, his astrologers and diviners, and offered them to be clothed with rank and privilege in purple, to have a gold chain that decreed honour and dignity placed around their neck, and be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom if they could read the writing on the wall or tell him what it meant. Now the significance there, the Bible tells us, is to be the third highest ranking. So that tells you the picture. Nabonidus is the emperor of the Babylonian Empire. King Belshazzar is the king of Babylon. So the third highest person would be the next under those two. And so the biblical account agrees with what the historical record is once again. So unable to decipher its meaning, the queen told King Belshazzar in Daniel 5 verse 12, call for Daniel and he will tell you what the writing means. This comment about the third highest rank also confirms to us that at this point in time, under these rulers, Daniel was no longer the king or the governor of Babylon. He was formerly with King Nebuchadnezzar. At this point in time, he's not. So when Daniel arrived, the king offered him the same gifts and authority as he had to the enchanters, astrologers and diviners. Daniel refused the rewards, but said he would read the writing and tell the king what it means. So Daniel explained how the king's predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, was given sovereignty, greatness and glory because of the Most High God, the God of Israel. He also said, when the heart of King Nebuchadnezzar was arrogant and hard with pride, the Lord stripped him of his glory until he humbled himself. And in Daniel 5:21, he said, and acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. And so here we've got King Cyrus, who's doing the Lord's work, who's got King Nabonidus, who's written and confessed that the God of Israel is the God of all, and here's Daniel inside telling Belshazzar exactly the same thing. And so God's work is never done. It keeps going. So Daniel went on to tell King Belshazzar that he knew of this, all of this, and yet did not humble himself nor honour God, but rather drank from the goblets of the temple of Jerusalem and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood and stone. For this reason, the hand that wrote the inscription was sent. At this, Daniel explained the meaning of the inscription. And so we go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 26. So Daniel 5, verse 26. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Daniel said to him that he knew that Nebuchadnezzar had recognized the God of Israel as the sovereign God. And so they've taken a decision to continue worshipping false gods, even though they knew this. As if to put a barb in the side they were drinking from, the goblets from the temple of Jerusalem, showing a complete and utter contempt for the Lord God of Israel. And so the message comes out. So the first one, Mene, M-E-N-E. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Remember what's happening outside. This is how specific it is. If you understand the history as I've given you, Cyrus is outside digging his way across to the front door. Nabonidus has already been nabbed. And so he's saying here on the last night, when he's having a festival with 1,000 other people, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. He didn't say, and he is going to bring it to an end. He said, and has brought it to an end. So on that night, it's all over. Tekel, the second passage says, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, which means that he hasn't been serving the Lord. He hasn't been running the empire or the kingdom the way that he should do, because he's leading his people to worship false gods. The third one, Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Okay, so this tells again whom is going to come next. And of course we know it's King Cyrus with the Medes and Persians. And so this word was given to him on that last night while everything was coming apart outside the front door, so to speak. So going on to verse 29, it says, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So once again, despite everything that's happening, on the night that the empire is ending, God has placed Daniel as the next highest ruler. So we see this constant repeat of God placing his people in command. So Daniel was proclaimed third, as I mentioned, because of Belshazzar and his father Nabonidus. So later that night, Agbaru and the army of King Cyrus destroyed the walls and burnt down the Ishtar gate, and they entered the city of Babylon. If we go to the book of Jeremiah, again I'm going to flip you back and forward a bit. So I mentioned the last couple of weeks you have to bring 3 or 4 bookmarks when we're doing these lessons. So Jeremiah 51 verse 58. Jeremiah 51 verse 58. And it reads, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Babylon's thick wall will be levelled and her high gates set on fire. And you might remember I just read a few moments ago what actually happened, and it said that they diverted the Euphrates River into an existing man-made basin dug much earlier to protect the city of Babylon against Median attacks. The water level dropped to beneath waist height, and the troops waded across to the Ishtar gate. When they got there, what did they do? They burnt down the Ishtar gate and knocked down its walls. Okay? So this word of Jeremiah again confirms what happened in history. This decimation of Babylon was the end of Babylon. So when you go to the German museum and you see all the tiles off the Ishtar Gate that they have, they're all being knocked down at this point in time in history. So it's quite extraordinary. So those tiles ended up on the floor because of King Cyrus the Great taking over the Babylon city with Daniel inside and with his allies outside. In Daniel chapter 5 verses 30 to 31, back to the book of Daniel again, Daniel 5 verses 30 to 31, and we've got some more to come from Daniel. It says, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. As Daniel said, God brought the reign of Belshazzar to an end, and his kingdom was given to the Medes and Persians. So remember in that prophetic word, in Mene, it said, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. And so Daniel writes here, that very night, that very last night, king of the Babylonians, Belshazzar, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And so once again, the biblical word agrees with the historical record. As Daniel said, God brought the reign to an end. Now Darius the Mede, from the book of Daniel, is actually what you call a titular name given to Gubaru from the Nabonidus Chronicle. So you know what a titular name is? It's a strange word, isn't it? So it's a titular name, Titular. So in other words, it's a title that's given, a name that's given as a title. And so this fellow Gubaru from the Nabonidus Chronicle, he was called Dara Yavahash in Persian. The name made up of Daraya means to possess or hold, and Vahu means good, meaning together he who holds firm the good. So Gubaru found the Nabonidus Chronicles transcript from the 70th year of the reign of King Nabonidus, was a Mede appointed by King Cyrus to rule Babylon at that time. Born in 601 BC, he was 62 years of age when Babylon was invaded, exactly the age given in Daniel chapter 5 verse 31. And so this is how they can identify exactly who he is. Okay, so when we get into some of these kingdoms, and this happens as we go into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, etc., and you start reading some of the names like Artaxerxes, etc., a lot of these names aren't their personal names, they're actually titles that are given to them. And so we'll come into that a bit more later. So once again, a lot of historical content, but the biblical word completely agrees with it. So on the 29th of October in 539 BC, King Cyrus entered the city and detained Nabonidus. The empire of the Babylonians fell and became part of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Syria, Judea, and Arabia Petraea now came under Persian control. King Cyrus became King Cyrus the Great, and he proclaims on this cylinder, and this cylinder's in the museum today. So again, this is a cylinder of clay which would sit on a rod, and you can spin it around and read it. And he proclaimed, I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world. I took up my lordly residence in the royal palace with joy and rejoicing. And so he's declaring to the world that he is the conqueror and he is the king of all. Now the prophet Isaiah declared what about King Cyrus? Is anyone aware of what the prophet Isaiah proclaimed or declared King Cyrus to be?
He's going to be his tool.
His tool. There was a word that we use when God appoints someone. What's that word? That he is the anointed. So it's a very strong word. So I'm going to take you to Isaiah chapter 45. So Isaiah chapter 45, we're going to read verse 1 and then verses 3 to 5. How many times do you get the opportunity to flick back and forwards through all these prophets who read the Bible? It's only in this part of the historical record fulfilling God's plan. So Isaiah 45 verse 1 and then verses 3 to 5. So verse 1 reads, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armour." What did the declaration of King Cyrus just said? "I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king of Babylon, Sumer, Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world." And so what's happening here is Isaiah is saying that God would take him as his right hand to subdue the nations before him and to strip the kings of their armour. Going on to verses 3 to 5 of Isaiah 45, it reads, "I will give you the treasures of darkness, riches stored in secret places, so that you know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name. For the sake of Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honour, though you do not acknowledge me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God." And so we find here that God appoints yet another king from another empire who does not know him. And so God uses people who do not walk with him to do his work. And so we see this recurring over and over again. So all of the statues of the various gods that the deposed King Nabonidus had taken to the city of Babylon will be restored to their various cities. The many displaced peoples of the Babylonian Empire will be repatriated, and temples throughout the lands will be restored. So what does this tell us? The biblical story says that King Cyrus will restore the exiles of the former kingdom of Judah back to what's now the province of Judea, and they will build the temple again. That's the biblical account. But the historical account, he's going to restore all of those kings and all of their gods back to their temples in the places where they'd overtaken them. And so God is using him to do his bidding, and yet the same applies to all the other kings and kingdoms at the same time in the historical account. Okay? So the inscription on the Nabonidus Chronicle says, "Gubru, the district officer, appointed the district officers in Babylon." The Holy Bible says it pleased Darius, in Daniel 6, chapter 1, Daniel 6, verses 1 to 2. It says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 100 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel." So the historical account says this same person, Gubru, who we know is Darius the Mede, his district officer appointed the district officers in Babylon, and the Bible says he appointed 120 satraps, which is governors of regions, to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. And so the historical account parallels to the biblical account once again. So once again, the word satrap under the Persians is a name you'll hear constantly, even in the Bible, and it describes a provincial governor who could be any subordinate or a local ruler. The Nabonidus Chronicle clarifies their role as district officers in Babylon. Okay, so accountable to the provincial king of Babylon to prevent any potential losses, Daniel distinguished himself with his outstanding abilities. He was so good that King Darius the Mede planned to elevate his position from one of the 3 administrators, and in Daniel 6 verse 3 it says to set him over the whole kingdom. So the other 2 administrators and the satraps, of course, they did not like this and sought to bring him down. But they could not fault his ability to manage government affairs, nor could they identify any corruption, so they said in verse 5 of Daniel 6, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Okay, so they're looking for a way. So the administrators and satraps went to King Darius and asked him to issue a decree or a law banning anyone from praying to any god or man for 30 days unless it was to him. The consequence for such an action was to throw the perpetrator into a lion's den. King Darius agreed and put it in writing, and in Daniel 6 verse 8 it says, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. In Daniel 6 verse 10 it reads, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. The men found Daniel praying and went to the king, saying in verse 13, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. So we find in this biblical account that even when people are persecuted, it's happened all the way through in the Babylonian Empire, that they are people of faith and they continue to be obedient to their God rather than to the ruler of the land. So the king liked Daniel apparently and tried to rescue him that day before sundown, but the administrators and satraps went to him again and reminded him that by the law of the Medes and Persians he was obliged to fulfill the decree. He relented and gave the order for Daniel to be punished. The men went and got Daniel and threw him into a den of lions that night, but the king was distressed and did not sleep. Early the next morning the king rushed to the den and was relieved to find Daniel alive and well, and Daniel explained to him how the Lord had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, and because he was innocent and had done nothing wrong, he had remained untouched. The king was relieved and extremely happy. Now I have this lovely illustration of this, and you may notice here a detail about Daniel, and that's that he looks rather old. Not surprising, is it? He's been in Babylon for a long time. Okay, so he is now an elderly man. And so here's of course the lions, and he's just sitting there obedient to his God, waiting until the time is that he can come out again. So Daniel was removed from the lion's den, and because of this, his accusers' ill-gotten plan to kill him, King Darius had them thrown in the den with their wives and children, and the lions killed them. King Darius then issued a decree in writing to the people of every nation and language throughout the land. He said in Daniel chapter 6, verses 26 to 27, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves, he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So you remember when Nebuchadnezzar put the 3 administrators into the fire and they weren't burnt, and then they came out. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? He issued a decree saying that you are not to touch these people. And so here he is now, not just issuing a decree saying not to do anything against them, but to actually recognise and tell people to fear and have reverence for the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and endures forever. And so we see a repeat cycle, excepting this time we see a much stronger message. So from this time onwards, in verse 28, it says, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So that gives you that picture again that Cyrus the Great was the ruler of the whole empire and Darius was the ruler of the Babylonian portion. So the princely rule of Darius the Mede, or Gubru, is acknowledged in the Holy Bible as under and simultaneous with the reign of Cyrus the Great. So I hope that it helps explain who's who, and the fact that in many instances in the Bible we've got more than one thing going on at the same time. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the story during the time of Shealtiel. So before we close tonight, I'm just going to touch on some genealogy, because this becomes significant now before we go to the next descendant. So Shealtiel, who is that next descendant, who is alive during this period of time, connects and fulfills God's covenant with Abraham, the covenant that ensured the Messiah would come from his seed. He is cited as the father of Zerubbabel in the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Haggai, and as the son of King Jehoiachin in the First Book of Chronicles. He's also listed in the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Luke. So I'm just going to put it up on the screen behind me as I explain the two genealogical pathways for the book of, over here on the left, Gospel according to Matthew, and on the right, the Gospel according to Luke. Now, the first genealogical issue concerns the father of Zerubbabel. In the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah and the book of Haggai, Zerubbabel is called the son of Shealtiel. And so if you actually look on the genealogical table, it just goes from Shealtiel and then, whoops, there's two other names there. And then we have Zerubbabel. So the problem is you read that and you go, well, hang on, how can he be the son of him if there's two other people in between? And this is where people become unstuck. Now, the Jewish Seder Elam provides a list of 39 generations of exilarchs or kings in exile, and in it Zerubbabel is also listed as Shealtiel's son, the same as our Bible. So in the First Book of Chronicles, under the royal line after the exile, it says the descendants of Jehoiachin, so in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 17 to 18, it says the descendants of Jehoiachin are Shealtiel, his son, Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechemiah, Hoshama, and Nedabiah. But next it lists the sons of Pedaiah as Zerubbabel and Shimei in 1 Chronicles 3 verse 19. So in other words, there's these other two names that appear and Zerubbabel doesn't. But in the next verse, as the son of Pedaiah, Zerubbabel appears. And so what's happening is we're getting his name as the son of supposedly two different people. And so we can scratch our head and wonder what on earth is actually going on. So, is Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, or is he the son of his brother Pedaiah? And so this is where we enter into a little bit of understanding of Jewish law. There's two possible explanations. The first is that Shealtiel died childless and his brother Pedaiah married his widow to fulfill a Hebrew law of inheritance. Now the inheritance law is found in Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 5 to 6, and it says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So if so, Zerubbabel is the legal son of Shealtiel, even though he was the biological son of Pedaiah. Now this happens more than once in the Bible. In fact, the birth of Jesus is exactly one of these fulfillments of laws. Now the second possible explanation is what we spoke about this, that there was only 5 sons of King Jehoiachin that received rations on Jehoiachin's rations tablets, even though the First Book of Chronicles says he has 7 sons. And so the historical record has the absence of 2 sons compared with the biblical record. So if Pedaiah fathered Zerubbabel for his deceased brother Shealtiel as the 3rd son, then it was the 2 eldest sons, Shealtiel and Malchiram, who actually died. So son of Shealtiel doesn't only mean a biological son either. In Hebrew, the term father applies to anyone from his household. Also understand that the word father in Hebrew, they don't have father, grandfather, great-grandfather. Everybody is father of, son of. It doesn't actually, in the English description, give us a means of understanding. Now, this genealogical record, of course, is written in Greek in the New Testament, and so the language is actually different. So when it was written, it would have had to be based on the Jewish laws, the Hebrew laws of the past. So either or both of these explanations can apply, but even if Zerubbabel was the only legal son of Shealtiel, he was still entitled to inherit his household and become the father of all other household members. So Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, was the next descendant of the house of David, forefather of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so when you actually go to Matthew chapter 1 and you look at the genealogical table there, it actually says Shealtiel is the father of Zerubbabel. It doesn't talk about these others. But when we look at the chronology in the actual tables in the Book of Chronicles, we find that there's these other people listed there which aren't in the genealogy of Jesus. So the second genealogical issue concerns the father of Shealtiel. In the Gospel according to Matthew in the First Book of Chronicles, it says King Jehoiachin is the father of Shealtiel, but in the Gospel according to Luke, Shealtiel's father is an unknown man by the name of Neri. So if you've ever looked at these tables, you'll see that these two names in the Gospel according to Matthew are in this position, but the same two names come up in the Gospel according to Luke, and it's actually Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, but there's several descendants before them. And so they're the same names, but they're in a different position. So we can ask that question again, is Shealtiel the son of Jehoiachin or the son of Neri, or are they different people with the same name? Now the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Luke do not mention Pedaiah. This confirms that Shealtiel is regarded as Zerubbabel's father. However, the Gospel according to Matthew lists Shealtiel as the son of King Jehoiachin, whilst the Gospel according to Luke lists him as the son of Neri, as it says over here. The answer is that the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Luke are actually different genealogies. And so that was the point of all of this. The two genealogical paths, they're not the same people. And so when we look at these two names here, they're actually not the same two people as the same two names on the other table. So we went all the way back to the time of King David. We find that he has two sons, one called Solomon, who became the king, and the other son called Nathan, who was not a king, and they both start off the two genealogical pathways which end up now in the Gospel according to Matthew and Luke. Okay? And so what happens is the prophecy that was spoken over the Messiah was that he would be a descendant of King David, right? So we find here that these two pathways, even though they're different lines of people, they are actually both fulfilling the prophecy that was given. Why? Because when we get to the end, both of these tables end up with the name Joseph as the father of Jesus. And so you might wonder, well, how on earth can that be? And so what happens, so I'll just slide here. So how can that actually happen? The reason is because genealogy was always something that's written by the male descendant. And so here we've got Joseph, son of, and then father of Jesus. Over here we've got Heli, Joseph, father of Jesus. Joseph is actually listed here because Mary's name doesn't appear in the genealogy. She can't because she's a female. And so what happens is Heli is the father of Mary, who is the biological mother of Jesus. Now, the reason Joseph is actually inserted into the table here is because when he married Mary, he then legally becomes the next descendant on the genealogical table. So this is very unique that both tables end up fulfilling the prophecy, Joseph on both, becoming the father of the Messiah. Okay, so I hope that helps you to explain those differences, because these pathways that we're actually talking Excuse me. So these pathways that we're actually talking about, they can seem a bit complicated, but obviously at the end of the day, if we understand how genealogy works and we understand how the Hebrew laws work, we can understand that there's these differences along the path, but they both end up fulfilling this prophecy, which is, for me, what I find quite amazing, because when the prophetic word said that there would be a son that comes from David, it not only was on one pathway, it was actually from both parents at the same time, so it was fulfilled both through Mary and through Joseph. Now, the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 1, he actually said, "The royal line of David is like a tree that has been cut down. But just as new branches sprout from a stump, so a new king will arise from among David's descendants." This was Jesus the Messiah. So tracing genealogy through the mother's side is unusual, but so was the virgin birth. Jesus was called the son of Joseph, and normally son is used as a biological term. However, Joseph was not the biological father, but the legal father by marriage. And so when we go to the book of Luke, in chapter 3, verse 23, Luke actually says, "So people thought." If you've ever taken notice of that scripture, it says that so people thought, because he wasn't actually his biological father. And so Luke actually mentions this. So it's in Luke 3, verse 23. So when the father of Shealtiel surrendered to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, so did his mother and his brothers, it says in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 12. All of the royal princes, 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14, were taken to Babylon as prisoners. So as the oldest son, Shealtiel, who we've been following, was the crown prince and heir in waiting to the throne of Judah. But he never returned to Jerusalem, nor was there a throne to return to. And so next week we continue on, because his son Zerubbabel is the one who will lead his people home. Okay. All right. So that brings us to the end of tonight's lesson. So we'll just pop up our end screen. And so we've been broadcasting on Facebook Live, so you can watch this back if you'd like to watch it on Facebook again. It will also be put up on our YouTube channel. If you type in Paul Brunch and the Jesus Movement, you can watch it there, or you can go to our website, thejesusmovement.com.au, and watch this back. Now, all of these scriptures, there's a lot of scriptures and a lot of detail. I will put notes onto the screen on the video that gets produced, and so if you watch it on the website or you watch it on YouTube, you'll be able to follow all those scriptures that I've been vocalizing tonight. So thank you for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next time.
And you